Hello and welcome to the Albuquerque Indian School, Two Sides of a Coin, presented by Friends of History, a nonprofit organization of volunteers like me, Raul Garza, that supports and extends the mission of the New Mexico History Museum. That mission is to communicate the history of New Mexico through the stories of its many cultures, and to interpret that history through public programs such as this. This virtual talk has been pre-recorded, so there is no live question and answer period. You are, however, welcome to leave comments and questions in the box below the screen. We'll do our best to respond in a timely manner. Now to our guest speaker. Dr. Theodore Jojola is an educator and practitioner in Indigenous Planning and Art in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and an enrolled tribal member of the Pueblo of Isleta. He holds a doctorate degree in political science from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, a master's in city planning from MIT, and a bachelor's of fine arts in architecture from the University of New Mexico. Dr. Jojola is the founder and director of the Indigenous Design and Planning Institute, and a co-founder of the Indigenous Planning Division of the American Planning Association, now called the Tribal and Indigenous Planning Division. He retired from UNM as Distinguished Professor and Regents Professor in the School of Architecture and Planning. He currently serves as President of the Society for the Preservation of American Indian Culture and the Chamisa Foundation Board, among other nonprofit organizations. He is also the co-curator of a very special exhibition at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center in Albuquerque through December 2025. Ted, thank you for your virtual presentation. The screen is now yours.
Thank you very much. I'm kidding, but thank you for that great introduction and just welcoming everybody to what essentially has been a lifelong passion to understand how it is that our communities have evolved and developed, and in particular, kind of the role that institutions have played. So what I'm sharing with you all today is essentially some of the kind of questions that have arisen as a result of my own life experience. So the Albuquerque Indian School was an integral part of my extended family. I did not go to the Albuquerque Indian School because I was actually a child of Johnson O'Malley, which in the 1960s allowed compensation to the public school system for me to attend those institutions. So I ended up going to Harrison Junior High Middle School as well as Rio Grande High School. Otherwise, I would have gone to the Indian boarding school, just like my extended family. So I'd like to go ahead and share a PowerPoint with everybody, and we'll go systematically through the evolution of how it is that the Indian school made its mark in the city of Albuquerque. I'm going to switch over to my share presentation. So we begin with this picture, which is really very much how it is that I began to really unravel the legacy of the Albuquerque Indian School. It's a very personal thing because when I was rummaging through some of the things that I inherited from my parents, I came across this amazing photograph. And centered in the middle is my mom. And she graduated in 1937 and graduated of the Albuquerque Indian School. And to her right is my grandmother, Lupita Papuyo. And then to the left is my aunt, who's also named Lupita after my grandmother. But what I love about this is the fact that here you really begin to see the kind of generational aspect of how it is that families, in a sense, grew in as part of these kinds of institutions in terms of their learning and how it is that they evolved in terms of their roles within the community. So what I love is my mom there with her brand new gown, cap and gown, looking forward to the future, so to speak. And then there's my grandmother on the right who's dressed traditionally, and that was basically her way at that time. Actually, there was only one time in my life that I remember her not dressing that way, and that's when she went to go visit her son, who was in, of all places, Omaha, Nebraska, and she wore a contemporary dress at that time. And we asked her why she did that. She said was because, she was going to go by airplane and she didn't want people looking at her. And then there's my late aunt on the left side, who was dressed in the vogue of that particular time. So you can really see it in terms of that kind of juxtaposition of the generations in terms of how things began to sort of move forward during that era. So we began the story with that. And that's how I became really interested in kind of trying to understand for myself why Albuquerque Indian School and what really did it serve in terms of the impact of not just my own family, but the larger community in general in the region. So the story begins with Doranas in 1881, which is when the Presbyterians actually rented this particular facility. And this is where the Indian school began its origin. It was basically just kind of a seed in the minds of the Presbyterians in terms of their missionary effort at that particular time, because just a few decades earlier, the New Mexico had become a territory of the United States in 1864. And with that, then began this idea of transforming this region away from just what was the Spanish and Mexican rule, but then bringing it into statehood, which would occur in 1912. So the story that begins to kind of lay the context for why the Albuquerque Indian School was actually the creation of or the completion of the railhead in 1892 in Albuquerque. And with that, Albuquerque became essentially transformed from what I call a one-horse town to actually beginning to have a reach to other places in the West and in the East. And it provided, in particular, a direct access to the railheads that began in Chicago and then went all the way to California. So with that was introduced essentially a new type of economy, which also began to impact and affect our community. This picture was taken in about that era, and what it shows is essentially people from my community plying the railhead here, or the railroad, I should say. And what was really important about what the context of this is that here the railhead divided between the South Passage and the Western Passage. And because we were using steam locomotives at that time, the, the trains would stop here in order to be able to take on water. And at the time that they were stopped, then it gave a good window for individuals from the community to sort of begin to ply their trade. And from that, then there were a couple of things that began to emerge. One was how people began to see the Pueblos themselves as this kind of exotic landscape and exotic peoples. But at the same time, the Pueblo people themselves began to see this as an opportunity to be able to um, take wares that they had, the agriculture that they produced, and use that as a source of economy then, which came into the community as a new source of livelihood. So one of the agents of that was, of course, the Fred Harvey House, and in particular, the Alvarado House, which is located in Albuquerque, was one of the places where the Fred Harvey chain began to introduce its tourist trade. And not only did it serve as a depot, but there was also the Fred Harvey House, which had a trading post attached to it. But it also became a stage where the natives themselves began to apply a lot of their wares. And what we see here is a really interesting example of that. You see these tiny little basket potteries. Um, and these were new kinds of ware that were introduced by our people at times when there was no agricultural produce to be had. So at the times when the train stopped and there was produce, they would take their baskets and sell their apples, their corn, their grapes, whatever it was that was in season at that particular time. But then during the winter time, then they kind of transferred that to these interesting little tourist items, which were in the shape of baskets. And if you actually look at the design that was put on there, you see the foliage, like the grapevines, the grapes themselves, or other types of things as kind of a way to make that connection in terms of the mainstay of the community, which was agricultural production. So that really, in a sense, then created this huge initiative, which became part of the tourism and the sort of exoticism that began to blossom within the Southwest. So a lot of people then who came into these depots then would take what were called the Fred Harvey tours. These became famous for being able to take people into the community. So that became really a way in order to meet and go out into the region and really partake of the traditions of the native people. And that's not only included the Pueblos, but it included the Navajo and Apaches as well, too. So this then became a segue to the development of Albuquerque and its transformation. And what transpired was essentially city fathers from Albuquerque who saw potentially the opportunity to be able to build an economy is based on their growth and the impacts of the railway, but also from the standpoint of education as being a vehicle for that growth. And in 1889, as this shows, this plat of downtown Albuquerque, it was just in the process of being formulated. And on the upper right-hand side, you see a plat that's called Indian School. So the city fathers at that time got together and decided to purchase 66 acres and essentially forward that to the Presbyterian missionaries in order to begin to support the development of an Indian boarding school. And that then took essentially what had been at Duranis in that particular house that had been rented, and then quickly began to issue forth the infrastructure for a larger school. So you can see very quickly here by 1885, after the city fathers had donated this land, then you began to see all this growth and development that began to occur in a very rapid motion. And the number of children then that were recruited here went hand in hand with the territorial government, who then had invested in educating the native youth, but doing it in a way then that segregated them as a specific kind of native population, but then also using that as a vehicle for both making them citizens of the territory, but also beginning to introduce religion and changing their life ways in terms of their verve to assimilate our people into the mainstream of what they saw as America. So you can see just within a few years then how this particular place began to blossom. And you can see that there was an enormous amount of time and effort and resources that were invested in order to begin to create this campus. And it began to then take this kind of economic engine in terms of spurring growth within Albuquerque, because you can just imagine there was a lot of materials that were put into the construction. There was a lot of new employment that came in. You had to have a workforce, you had to have teachers. All of these things then contributed in real vital ways in terms of beginning to be integrated into the commerce of Albuquerque itself. But what was really also a part of this in terms of the kind of challenges of trying to institute the boarding school system within the Albuquerque was the fact that this was largely driven by the Presbyterian missionaries, but it only took a few years before it transferred under the authority of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And when that was done, then the challenge that began to sort of emerge is the fact that Presbyterians were essentially an alien religion, so to speak, within the context of Pueblo communities, because it had been the Spanish and Catholicism that had basically converted most of the people. So even to this day, I would say easily over 90% of Pueblo people considered themselves to be Catholics. And then the question became, then who were these Presbyterians? And in particular, then the Catholics began to see them as a threat to the congregation if their children then were taken into the boarding schools under the Presbyterian reign. So the Presbyterian-based Indian boarding system, which then became part of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, as I indicated, had to become more aggressive in terms of how they actually went about recruiting children into the boarding school system. And I love this picture because this is this superintendent of the Albuquerque Indian School in that era who, for whatever reason, donned this big pottery on his head. It's kind of like an example of be careful of what kind of pictures you take. Um, and it just kind of shows the kind of crazy context that emerged with regards to kind of staging of this recruitment effort that was going on at this time. But the government had an agenda, and the agenda was really essentially began to make Pueblo people, or certainly the students within the Indian boarding system, citizens of the United States. And within that, a particular kind of system was introduced, very much consistent with other Indian boarding schools, and in particular, taking instruction from the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania to begin to institute a way in order to deal with this kind of reform. And the centerpiece of that was basically using the military system and its discipline as a way in order to inculcate students into taking these kinds of instructions and essentially weaning them away from their culture and instead bringing them into the full embrace of instructions that were really dictated in terms of how it is that they were going to reformulate themselves into what I call the other in terms of mimicking then this Western European type of lifestyle. So the military system really dominated until 1932. And that was really the result of new reforms that came in with John Collier, who was then Secretary of Interior at that time, who then abolished the military system. But this still became sort of a dominant way of beginning to really impose this kind of military dictate as a way to provide this kind of environment of reform. So this really shows the style of that architecture in terms of the campus planning with this gazebo in the center, which then served as a way to bring the kind of military presence and then use that for drill and instruction and bringing people into this kind of philosophy of what the Indian boarding school system was, and that also represented the first attempt within the Albuquerque Indian School to deal with this level of assimilation. So you can see just how this really affected and impacted the day-to-day kind of curriculum and scheduling that occurred within this Indian school system here in Albuquerque. But what occurred, which was really strategic, and I think in a sense it kind of represents the other side of the coin, as I indicate in my title about the effect of this system within the Albuquerque community, is the fact that there was an itinerant in journalist by the name of Charles Fletcher Lummis, who you see on the left-hand side, who became an adversary of Colonel Pratt, who was the one who was the architect behind the Indian boarding school at the Carlisle Indian School, and they became lifelong adversaries because Charles Lummis, who came out here to recuperate in 1882, essentially um, was boarding at the Pueblo of Isleta, and in that process of having lived there for 6 years, um, essentially found out that one of the children of the person who he was boarding from had been kidnapped and taken to the Albuquerque Indian School and forced to be enrolled there. And when the parents of his landlord attempted, in order to try and bring those children back in order to go there for summer work, the superintendent refused. And he took it upon himself then, in order to write a writ of habeas corpus in order to free those children from that dictate. And he was successful. And he was able then to leverage that in what I call the sort of shot around that was heard around the region, because as a result of the success of that writ of habeas corpus, then the Albuquerque Indian School could not impose that strict dictate that Colonel Pratt had tried to impose in terms of having total control of the children. And this coincided exactly with this kind of original context that I had talked about in terms of this division between the Catholics and the Presbyterians, because now the Presbyterians had to make this concession to allow the children to go back into the communities when they were not in school, as a way in order to be able to keep the children in the boarding schools and not being seen then as being a sort of a religious kind of initiative from that kind of standpoint. So it was kind of this interesting kind of give and take then that allowed the Albuquerque Indian School to become much more open and build this kind of interesting collaboration within the surrounding pueblos in particular about the amount of discipline and the kinds of strict types of things that they imposed in terms of keeping children there versus allowing them to go back and forth. So I just wanted to share one aspect of this from an individual who was my mentor, Agnes Dill. She was a matriarch within the Pueblo of Isleta, born in 1912, and graduated from the Albuquerque Indian School in 1934. She passed away about 5 years ago, and what this picture shows is her when she was in her early 90s. And then to the right there is a picture of her father, who went to the Carlisle Indian School. So you see two generations that are side by side here. And what this next small little video here will show from her side, and audio session that I was able to do with her, how this impacted her life. So let's kind of move towards that, and you can hear an actual voice from that era talking about her experience at the Albuquerque Indian School.
Well, I was born on June 23rd, 1913, in the Pueblo of Isleta. by a midwife and a medicine man, and grew up there as just a baby, I guess, because my parents moved to Winslow, Arizona as a little child, and so I spent most of my childhood in Winslow, Arizona, where my father worked in the roundhouse as a boilermaker. When I was 6 years old, I went to Pewaukee, New Mexico, where my grandparents lived, and entered the kindergarten there, went to school there for about 3 years. Then I went back to Winslow again and went to the public school there for just a year. My parents moved to Isleta, and I entered the 3rd grade. Then on September 1923, at 9 years of age, I entered the Albuquerque Indian School in the 4th grade. It was very different for me. However, it wasn't different for me to leave home because I was away from home most of the time, even during my childhood years. Really got into the swing of things pretty quickly. And I loved it. I really liked it because I loved people. I liked different tribes. I liked just almost anything. So I enjoyed my first year at the school. One thing that was so different from any schools or from anywhere I went was the military aspect of it. The school was under the military system. The students formed into companies just like an army post. Being still a little girl, I was in Company H. We were put in companies according to height, the tallest being A, and on down to the smallest, which was Company H. We didn't drill during the days. We could drill in the mornings, early in the morning. It was up to the captain if they wanted to drill their companies. 5:30 in the morning or before breakfast. Breakfast at 6:30 at 7 o'clock, like the military blows now. Every Sunday we had a dress parade, and we marched to our classrooms. We marched to our dining area meals. Everywhere we marched was to the band playing in the middle of there was a bandstand there. As I continued to be there for 9 years, then on my very last year, I became captain of Company B. I have dreams about all those things yet. I do. We had a school song, we had a football song, and we had class songs. I remember the football song. Hi-yo, hi-yo, it's an I-yo, 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 hey, nay-ya. That was when, a lot of times when somebody got hurt, they'd sing it louder and whatever. It was maybe like a medicine song. I don't know what it was. I really enjoyed it. I had a good time. From the moment I went in there, I just fitted in. Then we got into our dormitories, and there were certain girls put in certain dormitory, and these dormitories were rooms where there was one bed after another. On Saturdays, we all had to get fine-combed for hair lice. To me, it's funny now, but at that time, it was scary. We had great big playrooms. They were called playrooms, just great big halls, 2 big halls. And in this one hall, they'd have a big table covered with a white sheet. And each one of us, everybody had to go put our names down. The matrons, which were Indian matrons, girls who had graduated right there from the Indian school, would comb our hair. And there was lice, and what was funny was they would count each lice. Yeah, they would count each lice and put the number of Agnes Dill 57
Lice today.
lice today. can't think of any one great event except graduation. To me, graduation was a wonderful thing. It was a feeling of accomplishment. Even I have no negative feelings about the school. The Indian schools were a necessity to me in those days. Where would I have gone? Six of us children. We were only not six at that time when I started in going to Albuquerque. I think the higher spirit was already telling them what was going to happen in the future. And I think my dad and my mother somehow had that, because he always says they always told us you're going to have to compete with a white man. You're going to have to learn how to live according their ways. You're not always going to live like this. So one thing he always quoted, he loved poetry, my dad did, and he quoted poetry. He knew a lot of poetry. And he always had, his favorite though was the Psalm of Life. And this little tiny verse that he said was, "Be not like dumb driven cattle, be a hero in the strife." He always quoted that to us. And so we tried to be a hero in the strife. And maybe we didn't succeed, but we really followed their advice.
So I think that really gives a very wonderful introspection of her life, and how the Albuquerque Indian School played such an important part of her advancement. And it's kind of interesting in the context of, Indian boarding schools in general, that, you hear this side of the a story, but again, I think I attribute that largely to the context that emerged, where very quickly, because of concessions that were made by the boarding school there, then it became a much more friendly and nurturing environment, because they had to maintain, by hook or by crook, that relationship to the community. But not only did it affect the native community, but it also affected the internal community as well too. And this is a wonderful picture of one of the matrons from 1927, who was hired there at the Albuquerque Indian. And there you see her in her regular attire, but then she got befriended by a woman from who also was at the Albuquerque Indian School, from Laguna Pueblo. And during that friendship, she was allowed to take the dress of Laguna. So you see her with her kind of Anglo self on one side, and then her Pueblo transformation on the other side. Then you saw that also with other teachers in the school itself. This was at one of the parades there in Albuquerque, and here they're dressed to the hilt in Pueblo attire, holding those big ollas. If Colonel Pratt had seen this, he'd be turning over in his grave right now, because this is totally everything that he was against in terms of assimilating Pueblo people, or native people in general, but much less. So you see this cross assimilation of the Anglo teachers into respecting the culture of the region, as seen in this picture. So the campus became really an important place within the city of Albuquerque. It had many things that the whole Albuquerque community were tied into. It had a big auditorium where there were events that were staged, large public gatherings at the city level. It became a source of pride, and you saw the kind of reviews. They used to have tea times where students would host VIPs from the city. It became essentially an important mainstay and a cultural center for the city of Albuquerque, in addition to serving its purpose as being an Indian school. Here's the first aerial that was taken in 1937. You can see how large the reach is of this particular campus. Also, you can see it kind of being isolated, because it was then the hinterlands on the outskirts of the city of Albuquerque, but as the generations progress and urbanization has ensued, all of this has now been developed, as we'll see later on in the presentation. So there were various different aspects to the kind of programming that went on. I'm just going to go through very quickly some of these things so you can get a sense of how personalities played into this. Already saw Ruben Perry, the superintendent. I love this because this was in Agnes's yearbook, and she laughed about this because you would think that, he would write something that was more personal, like, oh, great student, hope you have a great future. But no, right to the very end, he says, good conduct ensures happiness. So it's that kind of strict dictate that even was represented in that writing in the yearbook. The other thing was the transformation of the school itself in terms of the teachers. After students then graduated from the Carlisle Indian School, many of them sought assignments in the Indian boarding schools, and that was true of the Albuquerque Indian School. And here you can see some of these native teachers that came back and began to work with their own students. And it just, in a sense, also provided a different face with regard to that kind of education in terms of our own people teaching our own students. There were also other things that were important in terms of the staging of the role of the Indian school. One that has always been understated was the Indian hospital that emerged there on campus, and it was done out of necessity, largely because many of the children there were subject to a lot of the diseases that were being transmitted. And of course, a lot of you may know that Albuquerque was considered to be a Lunger city, a city for rehabilitation for tuberculosis. It impacted and affected many of the students because they were all, of course, confined in close quarters. Later, there was the Indian Sanatorium that was constructed up the hill about 4 miles away. And this, in addition to taking care of parents and taking care of students, then began to create this full staff for an Indian hospital there. So many of the things that people recollect is the fact that children were born from the Pueblos in this facility, as well as being treated for whatever kinds of maladies that occurred during these times that they were in school. Another thing that was also a force at the school were just the kinds of activities that had occurred. We heard a little bit about the band and the kind of military style system. I love this picture because the drum major there in the left was actually my uncle. And when that was pointed out to me, I would have never have guessed because he was one of the most traditional and conservative people within the village. And I remember him because he never went anywhere in the village except on his tractor. And he was a farmer, and yet to see him in this kind of context just kind of blows me away that, he was nurtured in this kind of environment. And they also introduced all the accoutrements of the West. Here's an all-girls orchestra that was sponsored there at the Albuquerque Indian School. They also did various plays, and these plays were open to the whole community. And these pageants were really a necessary part of the creative aspects in terms of the theatrics. They would spend a lot of time creating these kinds of pageants, and this just kind of shows one. I don't know what the context of this, but I just find it a little bit odd and strange the way that they're posed in this picture. Here's one that is a whole theatrical performance. This one was called Hiawatha. So you can just imagine that these just were the cast, but in attendant to that was also the staging and the big theater production of the stage that was also assembled at this time. So this became a pretty big deal in terms of performance. Another thing that was also really important was just how the students themselves were organized in their civic roles. And one of the things that the Indian Club served was essentially a way in order for these student groups to continue to connect with their own Pueblo governments, and especially with the impact of a lot of the federal reforms that were coming in. The leadership from the tribes themselves made it a condition that they would actually go to the school and then keep them up to date with regards to what were the kind of politics and situations that were occurring within the community. So there was a real role of the Indian Club besides just socializing and doing performance and sharing their culture. There was also a civic intent behind it, which was really quite interesting. This picture, like had been seen in the little video by Agnes Dill. Again, this shows my aunt, who's the dorm mom at this point. She graduated from the Albuquerque Indian School in 1927. But you can see, even within this particular context of storytelling at that point, just how much this measure of assimilation was really coming into reforming and training and introducing these young children into the mainstay of American society. Another thing that also was an important aspect of this was agriculture and animal husbandry. The community there maintained its own dairy system. They would provide dairy products to the surrounding neighborhoods. They also had livestock breeding here. This is an interesting picture that was an award-winning heifer, and the pride of not just the school but the whole bureau in terms of the success that they were having in husbandry. They also grew and cultivated a lot of the acreage in the Indian school, with corn and chilies and squash and all these things. And in a large sense, they were also self-sufficient in terms of providing their food stocks for the school and then selling the surplus outside as well too. This picture shows the chicken coops, and they learn that aspect of it as well in terms of produce for fowls and egg farming and so on and so forth. So they were really teaching them the possibility of using this not only to improve their own livelihoods within the community, but potential business opportunities. And this particular picture here is taken at another location that was also part of the Indian school, where they maintained a ranch, and they would have those students there boarding in order to learn how to deal with handling livestock. So all of this was integrated into the learning of the vocations, and they divided them between those that were for men and those that were for women. For women, home economics became the sort of mainstay for developing their growth and development. There was a lot of uh, things that were done with regards to housekeeping, household maintenance, and these were going to transform into opportunities for staging them in terms of becoming matrons in not only for their own selves, but also within the larger community as well too. Another thing that was really important in terms of the kind of opportunities was in arts and crafts. And here's where the um, curriculum also began to shine, because they began to teach them important trades that would actually support the kind of tourism development that was going on, especially around the Southwest and Route 66. So here's silversmithing as part of the curriculum development that was going on. And they also introduced weaving. And in fact, the weaving department was really unique to the Albuquerque Indian School, largely as a historical um, coincidence that one of the teachers there who came from the Appalachian region by the name of Harrington actually knew how to do weaving, and she thought that she would introduce that as part of the curriculum. And then this blossomed into a full department where they actually hired the first native teachers as part of the Indian service in order to become the instructors. And here's one of them, and she's Navajo. And that she essentially, along with another Hamas woman by the name of Lucy, I mean, Lucy Lewis, um, became essentially the mainstay of this, and they exhibited and worked with students throughout the school, and they were exhibited even at World's Fairs in terms of the amount of artistry and skill that they brought into this new teaching area. Athletics were also another area where the school really shined. They were quite competitive. And when I asked my Aunt Dora, who I said graduated in 27, how it is that they competed so rigorously with places like the University of New Mexico and other major schools within the region, well, she said because many of the students that they recruited in were older students who may not have had much formal education, but came in as mature students. So in that, then they were able to create these fantastic teams that were highly competitive in the state. They won state titles. They even went out of state in order to compete with other schools, so on and so forth. And this became really an important part of the community building within the school. Here's an example of our team. Again, some of my family is represented within this, and it just kind of like brings a lot of smiles to me to sort of see them in this particular kind of context, as opposed to how it is that they had their own leadership within our communities. So careers then were really an important outcome. This shows an initiative of what was called the outing program, where it was intended to take the best students in the school and showcase them in a larger context. And these students here were actually selected to go to the Albuquerque public schools as a way of demonstrating their high leadership and high capacity for being as good or better than the students in the public schools that they went into. And within these outing programs, then they were able to be lent and placed in actual businesses, or businesses themselves were then built within the auspices of the school activities. Here they had their own auto shop, for example, where they not only taught the vocations for the students, but provided auto services to the larger Albuquerque community. Similar here, the kind of housekeeping that was occurring. Many of these young women actually serves as matrons within prominent families within the city of Albuquerque, kept their houses, and also took care of their children during the summer periods. Some of them, as in this particular case, actually work within some of the businesses within the city itself. And they then began to not only learn trades and vocations there, but they were still integrated into the curriculum within the school and lit in order to be able to pursue these kinds of vocations. A good example here is a candy striper that worked at I believe this one was St. Joseph's Hospital. So they gained an incredible amount of experience in being able to work within these situations, but also essentially continue their education within Albuquerque. These vocations then were sponsored by other organizations and companies, as in the case of this telephone operator. They, of course, were being trained in order to be um, secretaries and all these other kinds of vocations. So the Albuquerque Indian School really took the lead in providing the workforce in many of the areas within the institutions for the city of Albuquerque. So I'm just going to go quickly then with regards to then with all of the success that was being measured in the Albuquerque Indian School, what was the sort of decline and downfall of the school itself. And I call this endings because it really coincided with the issuance of the new Johnson O'Malley program that I talked about at the beginning of my introduction, where now we were provided the ability to basically go to public schools and not go to the Indian boarding school. This really undermined the Indian boarding school because many people now began to choose to go to the public school instead of the boarding school. And as a consequence of that, then not only did it impact enrollment, but sometimes even the quality of the students that went there. And it went then from being this kind of industrial vocational school to full-fledged educational institution, and now largely seeing all these cuts, it began to weigh in on who was actually then being put into these schools. And the reputation of the Albuquerque Indian School then became a reform school instead. And in the reports that you see in the 70s and the 80s, they talk about how it was only the worst of the worst that were actually admitted into the Albuquerque Indian School because they had been kicked out of so many of the other places. This was the only little place that would accept them in. But in spite of that, there was a rich and vibrant student body there that still continued to excel. Of course, they were also under the mainstay influences. I love this drawing that was done by one of the that was included in one of the editions of their yearbook, and it shows that sort of hippie period. And it's kind of ironic, I guess, in terms of talking about the context today about the legalization of marijuana, but here it is, way back in the 1970s with the cannabis there and the mezcal also depicted, and then the AIM movement, all of this kind of encapsulated in this kind of picture. Who would have known that, cannabis was going to be a kind of economic driver of Indian reservation development within today's context. But this was kind of the other part of how to control the type of student body at that particular time when everything was becoming working with students that were really difficult in a sense to kind of control within a strict education environment. I love this picture. This is a young woman from the Pueblo Heyday who became in 1979 Miss 4-H. And so it wasn't, you have two sides to this particular area, the worst of the worst, but then from that, then still is the dynamism of some of these kinds of students that would assume these kind of leadership positions. So there was this kind of tension and juxtaposition at this time of, how viable is the school and how, what was its legacy and how would it continue to move forward. But eventually all the kind of circumstances around it caught up because essentially they had very low enrollments by 1980. They were only 187 students enrolled in the school. Contrast this with its heyday in 1932, where they had over 1,200 students. And also at this time, the 75 Indian Self-Determination Act actually allowed the 19 pueblos at that time under the All Indian Pueblo Council to be the first successful organization or tribe to contract their own education services through the Albuquerque Indian School. But the issue was, what did they inherit? Well, they inherited hardly any students, hardly any faculty, and basically a sprawling campus of 50 plus buildings, all of which no longer were maintained, which were not up to code, not up to standard. And quickly it became the downfall of being able to maintain the structure when there was absolutely no compensation that was forthcoming to the Pueblo governors to maintain this. So the nail in the coffin came when several students and faculty succumbed to a gas leak. And it just underlined the fact that this place was unsafe. So they shut down the school then took the children in 1988 and moved them to the Santa Fe Indian School instead. And then they fenced off this campus, and in the process inadvertently then created this haven for the homeless. Just as, we're having our issues and problems to this day. The homeless basically came here. They didn't have, the Pueblo governors really didn't have the resources to keep them away. And they systematically then began to destroy the buildings as a result of them living in these places. And you can see in this particular room here, the Pueblo governors had tried all ways of trying to keep this infrastructure viable. They actually contracted out to the Indian Health and to the Bureau of Indian Affairs to use these as storage places for their records. But when the homeless came in, they basically stole everything that was not nailed to the floor. And then they would literally use these folders and files that they threw on the ground to create nests to keep themselves warm during the winter time. And when that didn't work, then they would build these fires in the corners. And that was the reason then a lot of these buildings then began to burn at a rate that even the city of Albuquerque instructed the fire department to no longer respond, because the attitude was, as long as it was a contained fire, then they didn't have to expend the resources to save these buildings, even though several of them were on the National Historic Registry. So unfortunately then, as a consequence of this situation, then the All Indian Pueblo Council was forced to raise all of the buildings, and only one building in the end actually survived. And then the policies began to sort of emerge with regards to how then they could essentially reuse the site once all of these buildings had been taken down. So the aftermath of this is that the Albuquerque Indian School, although physically it's no longer there, and it's met this incredible legacy of having been there for 100 years in all sorts of various ways and iterations in terms of its impacts, it still has a resounding presence to this day. And it's in a number of ways. One, of course, is what capacity and what skills then did the Indian students themselves continue to exhibit once they went out of school. And this is an example of the silversmiths that existed at this particular landmark called Mazel's. Unfortunately, this closed down right after COVID, but it became part of the legacy of what we call Route 66. They provided essentially the skilled workforce, as well as not only providing for the tourism that occurred with the trains and with the automobiles and so on and so forth, but became a mainstay of what it is that really is the Southwest native presence in terms of arts and crafts. Another example of this is those that came out of the weaving school department there at the Albuquerque Indian School also created this new industry. And this one was called the Tewa weaving industry, which actually began there at the Pueblo of Isleta, maintained itself there for about 10, 15 years, and then moved on to Duranas, and then began to create a whole industry around fabricating ties and weaving mantas and providing a lot of things that became part of, again, supplying things not only within the native communities itself, but also within the mainstream. And these hand-woven cloths that came out of there were really very impressionable and very much in demand, not only just here within the Albuquerque area, but nationally as well, too. Another example of this is the Chemo Theater, which has an interesting history in terms of being built in the 1920s and this Pueblo Indian Deco style, but its legacy is attached to this individual whose name is Abeda. And what's interesting about this connection is that he was the first person whose name is on the ledger of the first enrolled class for the Albuquerque Indian School way back in 1882. So he became known as the grand old man of the city of Albuquerque. And when the contest was issued to name the Chemo Theater, he won the contest. And it became a little bit derisive within the Pueblo of Isleta because he used his name in order to be on that marquee. So the chemo is actually in our language Kimu, which is his native name, which means little lion. So Pablo Beta then essentially had that kind of grounding in the Albuquerque Indian School, and you can see then what his influence was later in terms of just that theater there with the Chemo Theater. Another aspect of this, and this is the only building that remained, and it was simply because this became the headquarters of the Bureau of Indian Affairs agency office. So it wasn't torn down because it wasn't part of the Albuquerque Indian School property. It was annexed after that. And in that context of saving this particular building, there was a contest called Place Matters. You see Agnes Dill with her two sisters next to her, and they initiated a attempt in order to try and bring the attention nationally to the importance of this particular building in an attempt in order to save it from being razed to the ground once it transferred to the Pueblo. And in that context, I also had a a class that I did in human settlements, and one of the things that we worked on was to bring together the history of that building, and my students went out and began to find some specific information about it. And in that process, one of the students came when we were doing a site visit there and said, "Professor, I don't understand why we're working on this project because they just told us that they're going to be tearing this building down." And I said, "What?" And they said, "Yeah." And I said, "When were they going to do it?" And they said, "In the next few months." But interestingly enough, as we drilled down into the history of this building, one of the things that came to the forefront was the person who was the architect of this building is this individual, Joe Padilla. And he was a drafting instructor. And he used his drafting class in order to actually do the blueprints and the design for the building. And as far as we're aware, we discovered that this probably is the only building that we know that was actually designed and built by the Indian students of any of the Indian boarding schools in the nation. So you see the work detail here. It was the Indian students that were enlisted in order to actually construct this entire building, even though it was contracted by the outside. But the whole building plan and design was done by Joe Padilla. And it was when we brought this evidence then to the Pueblo governors that they changed their mind and then saved the school. And now it's basically the home of the Native American Community Academy junior high program. So in a way, it's kind of gone full circle to its original intention of becoming, once again, a building for education purposes. So I just love this picture because here's Agnes Still when she was 90 years of age. And the person whose hand she is that has the boa is Rochi. She's from Santa Clara Pueblo, and she is the widow of Joe Padilla. And unbeknownst to me, I didn't realize that she had still was still alive. And this is her at her 100th birthday. And I had thought that she had passed away and had gone into the records and saw a name similar to this and just assumed that that was her obit. And no, it was her sister that contacted me and said, Professor, I hear you've been wanting to talk to my sister. And we're going to have her 100th birthday party. Would you like to come? And I said, yes. So this was a reunion of Agnes Dill and her. And knowing now that she was alive, I said, can I come and interview you about your late husband? Because he had passed away actually very early on in his life. And she said, yes, I'm in a home, an elder home, come on over. We set a time. 2 weeks after this picture and a few days or a week after this picture was taken, she passed away. So, just underscoring the fact that just how fragile history is from that standpoint. So unfortunately, I never got that story. So here are the other things that were the outcome of the Albuquerque Indian School. So the Santa Fe Indian School now is still run by the Pueblo governors, has its own curriculum, it's a vibrant campus, and has its own education curriculum that's very much attended to Pueblo values and lifeways, and continues to this day. Another aspect of the continuing legacy of the Albuquerque Indian School is the campus of the Southwest Indian Polytechnic Institute. And I showed those wranglers at that place where the Albuquerque Indian School had its ranch, which was not contiguous with the 66-acre campus there. And now it's a sprawling tribal community college. So that was transformed from being the ranch into this institution. Today, the 66 acres are now called Amanyu Plaza. And this is a contemporary picture of it. To the right is the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center. And now you see all this commercial development all the way from the Holiday Inn to Dion's Pizza to the only Starbucks that is on Indian land, because this land is still held in trust for the collective benefit of the Pueblos. So it's become this mainstay and really amazing economic engine for this part of the city of Albuquerque. You can see the downtown in the back, so you can see how much it's still integrated within the context of its importance to this day. And then the last thing that I'll leave everybody with in terms of the legacy of the Albuquerque Indian School is that the discussions are still going on with regards to how best to memorialize its legacy. And you see a tiny little arrow there that points to what is a gravesite that was attached to the Indian School. And right now, the city of Albuquerque, largely as a result of the initiative that was launched by Deb Haaland, who was the Secretary of Interior under the Biden administration, looking at the legacy of Indian boarding schools and their impact, looking at how best to memorialize these graves that exist on this particular site. It's estimated that there's around 24 of these graves that are located there. They have their own sort of context and history that's attached to this, but this is still an ongoing issue within even the framework of the city's response and also the Pueblo's response of how best to acknowledge the legacy of this from its impact and influence and larger dimension in terms of what we think about the legacy of the Albuquerque Indian School. So in the context of this presentation, I hope I framed those both sides of the coins because, there's the one side that has to be acknowledged about the impact, in many cases, the downtrodden impact, the negative impact of the Indian boarding schools, by and large, in terms of their impact on the culture. There's a lot of references to this. But then the other side of the coin is the Albuquerque Indian School, in a sense, is an aberration from that, in the sense of the fact of the kind of context emerge, which made it into a more community outreach type of school that of itself also supported and integrated many of the kinds of cultural types of aspects into the school in terms of its curriculum and preparation of young people to assume their vocations and impacts and influence in terms of their leadership in ways that are not represented in many other Indian boarding schools. So with that, then I hope you enjoyed aspects of this presentation.
Thank you, Ted. That was a deep and rich look into the Albuquerque Indian School. Truly remarkable and important 100-year New Mexican story with a legacy and, as you say, a presence. You've given us a lot to think and talk about, no matter who we are or where we are. Now a few words to our audience. If you've enjoyed Dr. Ted Jojola's presentation, please give us a thumbs up below and subscribe to this YouTube channel. You can access dozens of past talks free and be notified of upcoming ones. Although our virtual talks are provided free, as a nonprofit organization, we appreciate donations in any amount. Friends of History invite everyone to make history with us. Learn how by visiting our website at friendsofhistorynm.org. For the New Mexico History Museum and Friends of History, thank you.